Very good morning to Germany, Poland, and Uppsala. And a very good afternoon, late afternoon to Seoul and other parts of Asia. I'm really very happy to have this session, to convene this session. My name is Sunghoon Park, a professor at Korea University. And I am a long-lasting friend and colleague of Professor Sebastian Bersick of Ruhr-Universität of Bochum. And we are all Monnet chairs. And there are several Monnet chair professors participating in this event. So I'd like to introduce our workshop a little bit. And then I'd like to introduce Professor Sebastian Bersick, who is the speaker of today's meeting. We are doing a project on behalf of the European Union under the title of promoting the strategies promoting the Europe and Asia connectivity. And this is one of major priority strategies of the European Union announced in September 2018. And we have been awarded this project from the EACEA of the European Union last year. So we are in the second year now, and we have just had a workshop, online workshop, of course. We could not gather offline, so we had the online workshop yesterday. And we had discussed about the Europe and Asia connectivity based on 6 papers we have prepared. Now, a 7th paper, but this paper will be the lead article of our publication to be published in a special journal of a academic, special issue of the academic journal. And Sebastian Bersick, professor at Ruhr-Universität of Bochum, has prepared it. And I'm really very grateful to him to give this opportunity to have to share his insights with the audience from Europe and Asia. We have now the number of participants just passed 100, and we have really very meaningful event. Professor Sebastian Bersick is talking about EU-Asia connectivity, concepts, contexts, and contestations. So he will talk about 30 minutes plus minus. And then we will open the floor for a discussion. And this discussion could be having the form of a Q&A session. So if you have any questions or comments, please chat, and then this chat will be forwarded to me, and this will be then relayed to Professor Bersick so that he can share his insights with the questioners. So without further ado, I'd like to open the session by inviting Professor Bersick for his special presentation and lecture. So, Professor Bersick, why don't you start?
Thank you so much, Sunghoon, for your kind introductory words. We already had a highly productive Thursday webinar yesterday, and it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to continue our exchange with colleagues and friends from Europe and Asia of the SPEAK project, and deliver a lecture on the topic of EU-Asia connectivity, concepts, contexts, and contestations. My talk is also part of the Bochum lecture series on EU-Asia relations within the framework of my new Jean Monnet chair on connecting Europe and Asia, people, power, and policies. One major activity of a Jean Monnet chair is teaching, and I'm thus very happy to not only welcome students from the Ruhr-Universität, Bochum, but also from Ruhr-Universität and hopefully from other universities as well. Since this lecture is about the relations of the European Union and Asia, and since our projects and Jean Monnet chairs are supported by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union, let me start by quoting a former Jean Monnet chair, that is Josep Borrell. In his blog, the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy / Vice President of the Commission for a Stronger Europe in the World, that's his official title, designation, he recently stated that it is clear that the Indo-Pacific will be the most dynamic region in the world and the center of growth for decades to come. The High Representative wrote these 2 weeks ago after 15 countries in Asia had signed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which will create the world's largest free trade zone, covering 30% of the world's population and GDP. Borrell went on asking and stating, the key question will be, what will be the nature of the regional order? And one might add, what will be the role of Europe in that order? Will it co-shape the evolving normative institutional architecture? And in how far does and could the new buzzword connectivity play a role in these dynamics? In my lecture, I will critically assess the concept of connectivity in EU-Asia relations from a regional and trans-regional perspective and draw conclusions that aim at stimulating debate about the EU's role and objectives vis-à-vis Asia and the broader region in the making, that is the Indo-Pacific. As I'm going to argue, a window of opportunity has opened up for the EU to increase its role in Asia, the Pacific, and the Indo-Pacific. However, the EU needs to demonstrate internal unity, and Europe needs to offer an incentive to the actors in the region. Such an incentive for strengthened cooperation and integration should take the form of a major political project that tells the story of EU-Asia cooperation and integration anew. We are living in quite remarkable times in terms of the quantity and quality of change that can be observed on the global and domestic levels of international affairs. COVID-19 and its worldwide disruptive impact on the lives of people, on the economies and politics is a disruption that transcends all living memory. Maybe the structural impact of COVID-19 can be compared to that of the end of the Cold War 30 years ago. The global economy is one dimension in which accelerated change can be observed. World trade declined by more than 10% in 2020 and is set to continue recovering only slowly from the contraction caused by the pandemic, rising on average by around 4.2% a year in 2021 and 22, as forecasted by the OECD. In the recovery process, very much depends on the second biggest economy of the world, that is the People's Republic of China. In economic terms, Beijing's so-called war against the virus is successful. According to The Economist, China is recovering from COVID-19 shutdowns, as the latest numbers of its Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index show. And also the digital economy and e-commerce sector have helped to boost consumer demand. According to a new survey from HSBC, China has overtaken the US as the top foreign market for companies across Asia Pacific. And trade is expected to grow in Asia Pacific in 2021 by nearly 7%. This year, ASEAN overtook the EU as the largest trading partner to China. However, the International Monetary Fund in its blog on Asia also points to risks that lie ahead and the grim prospects for a global trade-led recovery, mainly because of weak global growth, closed borders, and tensions around trade, technology, and security. In a recent book publication by the Asian Development Bank on the future of regional cooperation in Asia and the Pacific, it is observed that unilateral policies threaten the basic principles of the rules-based economic cooperation and practices. Yet, the recent signing of the RCEP that includes all 10 ASEAN countries and China, Japan, South Korea, as well as Australia and New Zealand, reminds us of the multilateral initiatives and processes for regional economic integration that do exist in Asia and the Pacific. Like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CEAPPP, and the Free Trade Area of the Asia-Pacific, FTAAP. Part of the change that can be observed is that regional integration is practiced in Asia-Pacific even though the United States under President Trump withdrew from multilateralism, and even though China is increasingly perceived as a risk factor in security terms. This only shows how intra-regional market dynamics in Asia are deeply intertwined with security affairs, as the ongoing deterioration of Australia-China relations exemplify. When it comes to regional integration, the recent developments in Asia paint a remarkably different picture than the one that can be seen in Europe. The United Kingdom left the European Union on the 31st of January this year, and 11 months into the transition period to finalize a deal on their future relationship, it is still unclear whether a successful agreement will be reached, although rumors have it that this week could bring a breakthrough. But even if agreement can be reached, the European project has been seriously compromised by Brexit. In Europe, regional disintegration instead of integration can be observed, while the Asia-Pacific countries of RCEP agreed to form the biggest free trade region in the world. However, RCEP still needs to be ratified. And yet, the European and Asian political and economic contexts of regional integration are quite different, as I will discuss in a couple of minutes. Too different are the historical and institutional contexts, but still more change can be observed in both regions and their mutual relationships than was expected by many observers. The reasons can be linked to the external shock caused by COVID-19, but also to the role of major powers, especially China and the United States. The related uncertainties create huge challenges for the European Union. In Asia, the nexus of economics, politics, and security becomes ever more relevant for foreign policy making. As a trade power, the EU has a major interest in participating in the shaping of norms and institutions that constitute the future order in the Indo-Pacific. China's role in there can hardly be overestimated, and this is also linked to the Belt and Road Initiative. In its global strategy in 2016, the EU had already declared that it will pursue a coherent approach to China's connectivity drives westwards, and also develop a more politically rounded approach to Asia. 2 years later, in September 2018, Brussels presented the EU-Asia Connectivity Strategy, Connecting Europe and Asia, Building Blocks for a New Strategy. Since then, however, the international context has changed rather dramatically. The US has continued on its unilateral way under Donald Trump, and China is now perceived in Brussels and in European capitals as an actor that is partner, competitor, and systemic rival at the same time. But probably the most important change is the impact that COVID-19 might have on China's international role. Similarly, the recent signing of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, has huge potential to impact the geoeconomics of the world economy because it shows the new dynamics of regional economic integration in Asia Pacific and China's role therein. And I will return to RCEP later on. The perception of China as a rival constitutes a major change in EU-China relations. It puts into question the fundamentals of the EU-China Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. It even raises the question whether it is still accurate to argue that the EU and China do not pose a strategic threat against each other. And the contestations between the EU and its now 27 member states and the People's Republic of China are increasing in number and scope. Market access, wolf warrior diplomacy, mask diplomacy, 5G technology, South China Sea, respect for international law, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, just to mention a few examples from the growing list of contentious issues. In addition, the current deterioration of China-Australia relations furthermore exemplifies the risks that can result from contestation. In view of the changing strategic environment, the EU-Australia leaders' virtual meeting last week agreed to enhance cooperation to promote shared interests in security and prosperity in Asia and the Pacific, spanning the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And leaders restated their commitment to promote sustainable, comprehensive, and rules-based connectivity. They also agreed to explore synergies between their cooperation on connectivity with third countries, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. The spirit of the meeting sends a clear message to Beijing. The EU is diversifying, deepening, and strengthening its relations with Australia, and connectivity is regarded as an instrument to project shared interests and norms. Germany will send a frigate in the Indo-Pacific, and German officers shall be deployed on Australian Navy units. This development is also in line with the recent publication of the German Indo-Pacific guidelines. Also, France and the Netherlands published strategy papers on their respective role in the Indo-Pacific. No EU guidelines on the Indo-Pacific exist yet, though. A further area of competition and contestation is technology and digitalization and the newly emerging field of cyber diplomacy, where cooperation but also competition and conflict exists. For instance, over the internet and how it should be governed. Chinese President Xi Jinping last week on the occasion of the 17th China-ASEAN Expo in Nanning suggested to ASEAN to create a China-ASEAN digital port to promote digital connectivity and build a digital Silk Road. The challenges that emanate from the expanding global cyberspace and the increasing global connectivity need to be addressed in multilateral settings. Establishing global rules, norms, codes, and ethical guidelines for how new technologies like the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, and quantum are applied. European and Asian state and non-state actors have a decisive role to play here. All these developments add complexity to EU-Asia relations. Not only because dealing with a global power shift from the transatlantic to the Indo-Pacific in itself isn't already challenging enough, but also because the EU only possesses limited agency, limited activeness, is neither a nation nor a federal state, and too often does not speak with one voice. But the more complex EU-China relations become, the more the EU is challenged to adopt its policies vis-à-vis Beijing and Asia. And this is mainly because the increase in strategic uncertainty is not only limited to the question of China's behavior, now that China has risen, but also to the question of the US behavior. Now that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have been elected, the expectations are high that the US and Europe can team up and coordinate their China policies. And indeed, there is new room of maneuver. France and Germany recently called for a transatlantic New Deal in order to adopt the European-American partnership to global upheavals. According to the foreign ministers, Jean-Yves Le Drian and Heiko Maas, who co-authored an op-ed in the Washington Post, we must work together to deal effectively with China's growing assertiveness and also to maintain necessary avenues of cooperation with Beijing to face global challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. However, it might be, or it might very well turn out to be a strategic miscalculation to think and expect that the US and the transatlantic relationship can deliver on the challenges and opportunities that the EU is facing with regard to Asia. Yes, the more Europe and the US are coordinating and cooperating vis-à-vis China, probably the better. But the answers to the importance of the Indo-Pacific in the 21st century should not overly depend on the possibility of a real interest in Washington, D.C. to increase coordination across the Atlantic. For the EU to play a role according to its interests and norms, more agency is needed. The EU cannot count on any other player to defend the European interest. In fact, Trumpism has demonstrated that in many ways the principle of self-help, as realism calls it, has regained practical relevance in global affairs. Within the changing strategic context, connectivity needs to be understood as a tool for the shaping of the international order, especially in a post-pandemic environment with like-minded partners. An example on the bilateral level is the EU-Japan Partnership on Sustainable Connectivity and Quality Infrastructure that was signed in September last year. Since the EU's competence and capabilities are probably strongest in the area of its trade policy, let me stay with the example of trade and the role of multilateral regional economic integration. But before I turn to the latest developments in regional economic integration in Asia, let me briefly reflect on the different development paths and historical factors that impacted on regional integration in both regions. Jean Monnet probably symbolizes and represents the European approach to regional integration more than any other person. He was the brain behind the Schuman Plan that led to the pooling of national sovereignty amongst the members of the European project. Theorizing on regional integration is largely driven by the assumption that national sovereignty and by extension nationalism too often has been the cause of contestation, conflict, and war in European history. The problem being that military conflict between nation states is inevitable as long no fundamental political concessions have been made by all regional actors. In the case of Jean Monnet, it was the idea that the establishment of a supranational institution can provide the framework to manage and overcome national rivalry and security dilemmas. The Schuman Plan resulted in the founding of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, the first international organization based on the principles of supranationalism. Unfortunately, the integration process of Western Europe also contributed to the political division of Europe. When the Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill aptly observed in 1946, descended across the continent. The Cold War set the systemic frame, not only for Europe, but for the world. Developments in Asia took a different trajectory, which, contrary to the European case, did not result in the pooling of national sovereignty and the evolution of supranational regional institutions. Seen from the perspective of regional integration, connectivity can thus be regarded as a very European concept, because in no other region have nation states agreed to even pool their sovereignty and form supranational institutions, with European law breaking national law. It is thus only natural for the EU to become a more proactive driver, a leader of connectivity, not only in the European intra-regional context, but also in the trans-regional and the interregional context, for instance, between the EU and Asia, between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Compared to the EU, the regional architecture of Asia is a structure very much still in the making. The process was mainly stimulated by the end of systemic bipolarity in international relations in the early 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989 in Germany. Even before, in 1967, ASEAN had been founded, but it was the end of the so-called Cold War that triggered new region-building efforts and policies in Southeast Asia and beyond. In 1994, the ASEAN Regional Forum was founded, and already in 1989, 12 Asia-Pacific countries had met in Canberra and founded the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC. APEC is, on its own account, the premier forum for regional economic cooperation, whose new Putrajaya Vision 2040 aims at an open, dynamic, resilient, and peaceful Asia-Pacific community by 2040. Yet, it has not become the premier forum for regional economic integration, at last for the time being. The main reason is the rivalry between two of its 21 members, that is China and the US. It is APEC's dilemma that, on the one hand, because of China's and the US participation, it has the potential to truly integrate the Asia-Pacific in economic terms in the form of the envisioned free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, while on the other hand, it is precisely the fact that not one but both actors are part of APEC that pose a major obstacle towards regional economic integration. Much thus depends on the further development of US-China relations. On his first day in office, US President Trump withdrew the USA from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement. This was a major political decision which went rather unnoticed in Europe. The president continued on his path against multilateral regional and global governance institutions, as in the case of the Paris Climate Agreement, the UNESCO, the WHO, or the WTO, and even NATO. It remains to be seen in how far President Biden will recalibrate the US-China policy and whether the USA will reconnect to Asia-Pacific multilateralism. Seen in the strategic context of the economic security nexus, it is all the more remarkable that 15 Asian countries now signed a regional trade pact that has the potential to propel regional economic integration. RCEP is an important political development of high symbolic meaning. It shows Asia-Pacific's commitment to continuing multilateralism and harmonization. For the first time, China, Japan, and South Korea participate together in a regional FTA. This could have positive knock-on effects and, for instance, also facilitate the further economic integration of Northeast Asia, even though many political and economic obstacles exist. Another example is the CEAPPP. During last week's APEC summit, Xi Jinping said that China will favorably consider joining the comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. According to an Euler-Hermes Allianz research report, RCEP should foster stronger regional trade integration, but it could also make the region more attractive to further diversification of supply chains for multinational companies. From an economic perspective, RCEP mainly consolidates and updates existing free trade agreements between ASEAN and its partners. In fact, the average tariff of ASEAN countries on exports from RCEP partners had already dropped from 4.9% in 2005 to 1.8% currently. But RCEP reduces non-tariff barriers by creating a common rule of origin, that is, harmonizing the information requirements and local content standards for business to be eligible to the preferential terms of the agreement. Since all regional FTAs have their own rules of origin, RCEP will therefore facilitate supply chain management and reduce transaction costs for trading with multiple countries. It is estimated that the common rule of origin could reduce export costs, thereby boosting merchandise exports among signatories by around $90 billion on average annually. The development shows that multilateral regional economic integration is a chosen model of Asian governments to counter unilateral policies and the dysfunctionality of the World Trade Organization. It also brings to the attention that the EU is not part of the ongoing processes of multilateral regional economic integration in Asia, neither in the APEC context nor with regard to RCEP or the CPTPP. So where and why does connectivity enter the picture? The EU's Asia Connectivity Strategy was published by the EU in September 2018. It is an example of a rather reactive strategic way of thinking and foreign policy making, because it was drafted in reaction to China's Belt and Road Initiative at the end of the European Commission's presidency of Jean-Claude Juncker. And it is, by the way, quite remarkable how bluntly the European External Action Service and the Commission recognize that the connectivity strategy is a reaction to China's Belt and Road Initiative. According to the document, the EU is promoting an approach to connectivity that is sustainable, comprehensive, and rules-based. This means that connectivity has to be economically, fiscally, environmentally, and socially sustainable in the long run. Connectivity is about networks and the flow of people, goods, services, and capital. And it means that it is about internationally agreed practices, rules, conventions, and technical standards supported by international organizations and institutions that enable interoperability of networks and trade across borders. Maybe it is the element of a rules-based approach that makes this European definition of connectivity most distinct from others and sets it apart. It points to the normative institutional dimension of connectivity. Also, the 10 Southeast Asian ASEAN countries have developed a connectivity strategy, and that already in 2010, which focuses on their mutual connectivity and the vision of a seamlessly and comprehensively connected and integrated ASEAN that will promote competitiveness, inclusiveness, and a greater sense of community. During the 23rd EU-ASEAN ministerial meeting, which was held via video conference 2 days ago, the ASEAN-EU Ministerial Statement on Connectivity was adopted. Sustainable connectivity is considered to be a key priority for the region-to-region relationship. And in view of the unique experience of connectivity and regional integration of ASEAN and the EU, the leaders reaffirmed their commitment to promote connectivity within and between ASEAN and the EU. This shall allow, amongst others, to advance the EU's and ASEAN's respective strategies for green growth, increase the cooperation, and spur sustainable investments, especially in infrastructure. In this respect, digital connectivity with a focus on people as a key enabler to inclusive growth and sustainable development through cooperation in the areas of digital innovation, digital infrastructure, and logistics is highlighted. In addition to the declared intent to promote connectivity, the EU and ASEAN elevated their relationship to a strategic partnership. This upgrade of the ASEAN-EU dialogue partnership is indicative for and needs to be explained in the light of the changing international context in general and EU-Asia relations in particular, especially with regard to China's increasing assertiveness. The upgrade of the relationship is of high symbolic meaning, but it will need to be backed up by what is often called tangible or concrete results. In the area of trade and investment, that would be economic integration and trade liberalization in the form of a comprehensive ASEAN-EU free trade agreement. So far, bilateral trade and investment agreements have been concluded with Singapore and Vietnam, respectively. However, it can be questioned whether the strengthening of EU-ASEAN relations is sufficient to respond to the changing global context and the challenges it entails, especially with regard to the role of the United States, China, and China-EU relations. It is therefore in the interest of the EU and its member states to embed ASEAN-EU relations in a broader institutional architecture and to provide a strong incentive and rationale for countries to join and participate. The institutional framework to embed EU-ASEAN relations, and by extension a future EU-ASEAN FTA, could be the Asia-Europe meeting. ASEM has the advantage that cooperation between its now 53 members has been practiced for nearly 25 years. It has the disadvantage, though, that the cooperation has hardly resulted in tangible results, for instance, with regard to trade and investment issues. Because of collective action problems and the lack of political will, ASEM still remains a rather low-key forum in comparison to APEC, for example. Maybe this is the reason why this year's ASEM summit was, because of COVID-19, postponed to next year. Instead of having a virtual ASEM summit, like in the case of the virtually conducted summits of, for instance, APEC, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or the G20. While Asian and European leaders did not meet, all leaders of the other respective fora met at least online, and China's leader, Xi Jinping, participated in all of them. However, in recent years, ASEM has incorporated the issue of connectivity, and in 2017, ASEM foreign ministers even contributed a definition of what connectivity means and is about in the ASEM process. Accordingly, connectivity is about bringing countries, people, and societies closer together. It facilitates access and is a means to foster deeper economic and people-to-people ties. It encompasses the hard and soft aspects, including the physical and institutional, social, cultural linkages that are the fundamental supportive means to enhance the economic, political security, and socio-cultural ties between Asia and Europe, which also contribute to the narrowing of the varying levels of development and capacities. ASEM connectivity aims to establish the sense of building ASEM partnership of shared interests. It upholds the spirit of peace, development, cooperation, and mutual benefit. End of quote. This is a very broad understanding of connectivity, though, and it lacks a real strategic vector. Maybe the latter is currently most fundamentally needed in EU-Asia relations. What is the rationale for Asia-Europe cooperation? To answer the question, it is interesting to compare the international and regional contexts when the first ASEM summit took place in 1996 and today's. For all the change that has happened since then, there is also continuity. In the early 1990s, after the end of the Cold War and with the development of new strategic uncertainties, ASEAN countries clearly had the China factor in their mind when they thought about establishing a forum for Asian and European leaders to meet. ASEAN saw the need to engage Beijing, to coax China into the mainstream of world affairs. And it was also the interest of ASEAN leaders to meet their peers from EU member states in a dedicated forum. Europeans saw the opportunity to play a stronger role in Asia, especially in Asian markets. This was the time of the so-called East Asian miracle and of apparent regional economic integration in Asia-Pacific and APEC. At least some Asian actors also expected Europe to potentially play a bigger security role in Asia. The Europeans, however, never really delivered. The expectations on the Asian side were hardly met after the Asian financial crisis had kicked in 1998. Since then, the global and regional geopolitical and geoeconomic contexts have changed significantly. Multilateralism and the liberal order, even the concept of the West, is compromised. But there is also continuity, and this is related mainly to China. How to deal with a rising China? How to deal with China in a post-pandemic environment now that it effectively has risen? In the early 1990s, ASEAN's answer was that you need to engage China, especially by creating regional institutions instead of antagonizing it. The ASEAN countries continued on their road to integration. Regional institutions like the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asian Summit, or interregional ones like ASEM were founded, all with various success. Geopolitics and the interests of a few often trump the region-building agenda. In view of these challenges, And in the new context of a post-pandemic environment, the EU might consider providing a new rationale for EU-Asia relations by proposing a strategic vector in the form of a major political project to jointly work towards a future comprehensive Asia-Europe free trade agreement. Such a political project would aim at multilateralizing existing FTAs between the EU and Asia, EU-South Korea, EU-Japan, EU-Singapore, EU-Vietnam. But the project should also facilitate ongoing negotiations with like-minded countries like Australia or India or Indonesia. And it could also provide a reason for ASEAN and the EU to move towards a region-to-region agreement for the EU and China to enter into free trade negotiations once and if the ongoing negotiations for the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment will be successfully finalized. Based on its open and inclusive character, all interested economies could participate, also Taiwan, if considered appropriate. With regard to the area of trade and investment, the EU would thereby follow a policy of re-multilateralization, as opposed to its current rather bilateral approach. Such an overall policy approach should send a strong signal to China and Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy project, that is the Belt and Road Initiative, as Europe would present a new narrative, a new story of its role in EU-Asia relations, namely that of a co-leader in multilateral connectivity as opposed to bilateral connectivity. In view of China's expected new 5-year plan, its new dual circulation strategy with a focus on its domestic market and technological independence, as well as China's new development paradigm, as it has been promoted by Xi Jinping at the recent APEC CEO dialogues, such a new role of the EU should facilitate the shaping of the evolving regional order in Asia and the Pacific. During his speech, Xi Jinping stated that China will get more actively involved in global economic governance. And the Belt and Road Initiative is considered an important tool in its new development paradigm, as China will further harmonize policies, rules, and standards with Belt and Road Initiative partners. The Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party promised. The new economic strategy, Xi furthermore highlighted, shall contribute to the building of a community with a shared future for mankind. The EU's offer of a political project in EU-Asia relations and of a new narrative of trade would provide for an alternative that complements the Chinese approach to the evolution of a normative and institutional architecture. Summing up, it can be concluded that if actors in the Asia-Pacific proactively engage in multilateral regional integration, as in the cases of RCEP and CEAPPP, then the EU is a natural partner. But the EU needs to convince its counterparts, especially ASEAN and its members, that it is ready to deliver. In this process, a comprehensive ASEAN-EU FTA would be a first litmus test. The EU should therefore offer its partners in the region a political project, an Asia-Europe free trade agreement. A more integrated connectivity strategy is needed to provide additional rationale, a vector, or in EU parlance, finalité, to the various processes in bilateral and multilateral formats that exist between the EU and Asia. The EU needs to frame itself as a provider of collective goods by creating markets and development for all based on rules and norms jointly agreed on. At the same time, however, each step needs to be developed and judged in light of the EU's interests.